Hello everyone, Connor here with Courage, and I am delighted to be joined by royal historian Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Rafe, you recently got an honour by the Crown, if I'm thinking correctly.
By His Majesty, very kindly, a coronation medal for educating the Commonwealth realms about the importance of the monarchy and their constitutions. That's very nice, unexpected.
Fantastic. Well, in the spirit of education, I think the Labour government could do with a little bit of that, because we've got David Lammy, who, if you've seen his mastermind clips, is not quite the mastermind, but instead we've got him representing us as Foreign Secretary around the world, and historically and recently they flirted with the idea of slavery reparations. When he was in opposition, he said, "We as Caribbean peoples demand reparations." What precisely for? I must scratch my head. But let's just say race grifters of the failing states like Barbados, who are so concerned about slavery they've been driven into the arms of China, are now demanding trillions in reparations. There's a group of them saying we need 18 to 19 trillion for the cardinal sin of the British Empire improving their nations in some ways. Can you talk about Britain's history of slavery and why we shouldn't really have much to be ashamed of in this regard?
Yeah, well, firstly, someone needs to remind David Mastermind Lammy that being Foreign Secretary doesn't mean you advance foreign interests. You should be advancing British interests as Foreign Secretary. Not sure he got the memo on that one. Look, it's quite clear in terms of Lammy and the Labour Party that they are essentially putting their own ideology ahead of Britain's national interest. It's ahead of its security interest, ahead of its economic interest, and also ahead of what should be the real purpose of government, which is to celebrate also British achievements. And we can actually be quite proud in this country that whilst slavery was universal, dating back thousands of years, just as old as prostitution and taxes, I imagine, we were the first empire in the world, and Western Europe was, to be infused with that spirit of Christian missionary zeal. And it was that Christian element that went through the British Empire in the second half, which was all about atoning for the sins of the first half. And actually Britain became the first country in the world to deliberately make itself poorer to advance a moral good. It spent a sum of £20 million, equivalent to £200 billion today, freeing the slaves, but that wasn't enough. It then went further. It then spent a sum equivalent to 2% of GDP, a sum basically like our entire defence budget, on the West Africa Squadron, which enforced an end to the slave trade on the high seas. Never before in history was this achieved. And of course, this was done at the huge protest of many Africans who were profiting lucratively from the slave trade. In fact, of course, the British and the French had to enter Africa and forcibly stop them from going into slavery well into the 20th century. People need to remember, of course, that more Africans were held in bondage by other Africans in Africa than were ever transported across the ocean. No Europeans, no British people enslaved Africans. Africans enslaved other Africans. European ships were moored off the coast and simply bought slaves from the slave market. And that's why we know that none of this is actually about slavery at all. People must understand, whenever you hear one of these grifters talking about reparations, it is an attempt to undermine Britain and America and the West more broadly, and it's plain, pure and simple a money grab. Because if this was about slavery, these people who are such great civil rights activists should be picketing outside the high commissions and embassies of African countries like Chad and Mali and Mozambique and Cameroon with 800,000 slaves. CNN reports that there are hundreds of slaves sold every week in Libyan markets. Yet they're completely silent about all of that. And you would have thought the fact that 7 in every 1,000 Africans today is a slave, 10 million people, would be more important to civil rights activists than grievances from 200 years ago. We're talking about your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, 800 years, 8 generations. And whenever I've spoken to a Caribbean or debated one on this topic, I say, well, why exactly do you want reparations? In what way has your life been blighted by slavery? Because as abhorrent and horrible as slavery is, and we don't need to explain that, of course it was horrible, and if slaves were alive today, they would be, absolutely, I would support reparations for them. The lives of their descendants today are incalculably better and richer because their ancestors were slaves than if it wasn't. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at where the slaves came from in West Africa, in Benin, for example, GDP per capita in Benin is about $1,400. In Barbados, it's $17,000, more than 10 times higher. Life expectancy in Benin is around 62. It's around 79 in Barbados, Trinidad. So we're talking about factors, multiples of years, multiples of thousands of dollars. By every measure, the Caribbean states are successful middle-income countries with higher qualities of life on the UN Human Development Index than Mexico and Brazil. And in fact, it's thanks to their British colonial inheritance that they are great successes, because of what the empire bequeathed to them in terms of the rule of law and the English language and the common law, which made them global players on the global market, in terms of the civil service we structured, the hospitals, the universities we built, the military and the police, all of the institutions and the infrastructure to create a successful modern state. You would think, actually, the Caribbean states would be more concerned about the plight of their brothers and sisters in West Africa, and so perhaps to say that reparations are more deserving to go there if they're going to go anywhere, rather than in these successful middle-income countries. This is, in terms of the Caribbean, a pure cash grab, and they can see the weakness of the Anglosphere. They can see the West tying itself up in knots and wearing horsehair shirts. That's why they're playing the politics of grievance and victimhood to try to guilt us into paying all this. We must resist it, and we must call it out for what it is.
Very well put. I mean, this really does strike a blow to the Best of Britain Twitter account, funded by George Soros, by the way, who were aghast when Kemi Badenoch said the not at all controversial assertion yesterday that some cultures are better than others. I think you've just proven with that example, or with the abolition of bride burning in India, the British Empire had a unique moral force that was a net good for the world, and perhaps we can get round to abolishing prostitution and taxes while we're at it. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in relation to Britain's history is perhaps some critiques coming from our right, our side, which is we've had discourse in the last year, and I'm sure you're tired of it, but it has been reignited recently with an interview between Tucker Carlson and Piers Morgan as to whether or not the legacy of Winston Churchill is complicated by some of the actions he took during the Second World War, allying with Stalin, unfortunately handing over the Cossacks to die in the gulags, which was not very good, and also whether or not the antiquated statutes of the ECHR or the Geneva Convention on Refugees devised for Dutch Jews fleeing the Nazis now applying to Pakistani rapists and Albanian criminals whose kids don't like foreign chicken nuggets, whether or not that casts a long shadow over the legacy of who was once voted the greatest Britain. Do you think these charges levelled at Churchill are fair, or do you think that the man is being misrepresented with views that he himself would not hold were he brought to our modern day?
I fear that the people on the right, who I'm hugely disappointed with, who are perpetuating this, are actually part of this post-truth society that we talk about, because it seems almost as if they are so beholden to a certain ideology that they are willing to actually sacrifice some of our great heroes if it in some way plays into the narrative that they feel of being betrayed by generations in the past. By no measure is any of that correct, and it's simply historically ignorant to claim otherwise. Look, there are very few moments in world history. Well, actually, this was probably the only moment in world history where the future of Western civilization, the future of the world, rested briefly upon one man's shoulders. Because you have to remember, firstly, unlike what Tucker Carlson thinks and so forth, Churchill didn't drag America into the war, let's make that clear. It was Pearl Harbor that dragged America into it. It was the Japanese who dragged America into the war, and it was Germany that declared war on America. Churchill had nothing to do with it. Churchill also wasn't Prime Minister when the Second World War started, but he inherited the Second World War. If people had listened to Churchill in the 1930s, when he was the sole voice in the wilderness, warning about the threat that Nazi Germany paid, if people had built up Britain's defences, World War II perhaps would have been avoided. And it's thanks to people ignoring Churchill that we got ourselves into that terrible predicament which he inherited on May the 10th, 1940, when he became Prime Minister. And if any other Prime Minister had been there, say Lord Holyfox, Lord Halifax, who was also vying for it, it seems almost inevitable, I think, that Britain would have sued for peace. And we then would have been living at the point of a gun, because Adolf Hitler had torn up every single treaty he had prior to that. He marched into the Sudetenland, he then marched into all of Czechoslovakia, he then tore up the Nazi-Soviet aggression pact with Stalin. And if Britain had sued for peace, Hitler would have been able to turn 100% of his forces against the Soviet Union. And as Stalin and Khrushchev both confirmed after the war, if Hitler had used 100% of his forces against them, rather than just the 70% that he used, they would have been defeated. And they also would have been defeated if Britain and America hadn't supplied them with arms and munitions and everything else. They needed American and British supplies to stay in the war. And as any schoolboy knows, it was the Eastern Front that took on the brunt of that. If it wasn't for Britain and America supporting Russia and being allied to it and not suing for peace, Germany would have controlled Europe, would have controlled Russia, would have controlled the Middle East oil fields, would have controlled Africa, and with Japan would have controlled Asia and Australasia. And then it would only have been a matter of time before he turned his gaze upon Britain. Because what a lot of people who are tactical don't understand is that Hitler didn't love Britain. He admired the British Empire greatly, but he didn't have a romantic affiliation with Britain at all. And he still saw himself with that messianic great man concept in the same league as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Napoleon. And what couldn't Napoleon achieve? Napoleon couldn't conquer Russia, and he couldn't conquer Britain. And Hitler, when he went to the Pantheon and looked down upon Napoleon's body, said this was the finest moment of his life. And he could therefore achieve what Napoleon didn't. And he would do that by fooling the Brits into a peace treaty, which either he would renege on and invade, or else we would be a vassal state to a fascist state. And we would have, of course, all of the peoples of Western Europe, not just the Jews and the Slavs, all of Western Europe under the Nazi jackboot. And then, of course, the British tube alloy specialists who went over to America and went involved in the Manhattan Project got us the nuclear bomb for the West, for Britain and America. They wouldn't have gone there. So it's entirely possible that Germany would therefore have got the nuclear weapon first, and then the Americas, hitherto free from Nazi interference, would also have been living at the points of a gun. When you had Franklin Roosevelt's famous Arsenals of Democracy speech, where he said, if Britain goes down, we will be living at the point of a gun. So very briefly, for 1 year, whilst we waited for America and Russia to enter the war, the future of the world rested upon Churchill's shoulders, and we should all thank God that he was there.
Also important to point out that for as much of the revisionism that is going on, you can add the Reich Concordat with the Catholic Church to that list of treaties that were violated, because it wasn't just Jews that were put into concentration camps, obviously the largest number. It was also many observant Catholics, conscientious objectors, and Catholic priests too.
Another point just to make here, and it's funny because the left are accusing Churchill of being a racist all the time, towards Indians and everybody else, and towards the Kurds and towards Africans. And now you've got the right saying it's because of him that we've got mass immigration into this country. I mean, the poor man can't win any of this. Look, people used to blame him for supporting a whites-only policy of immigration into this country as well. Churchill, died in 1965. He left office in the 1950s. He couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams that the Britain today would be the Britain that it is. And he would be utterly appalled. And he, of course, I'm sure, would be doing everything he could to have warned us about this years ago. He probably would have been next to gosh, what's his name now? I completely forgot. Rivers of Blood. Enoch Powell. How can I forget Enoch? With all of that. We have to remember, I've campaigned for a long time that we need to abolish the United Nations Convention on Refugees, 1951, because as you rightly said, nobody foresaw the mass movement of peoples across continents. That was intended for Europeans and Poles and stuff. My own family my great uncle was ADC to the Polish president. We were stuck in Britain after the war. We couldn't go back to Poland because it was communist. We would have been imprisoned and arrested. Some of my family were sent to the gulags in Siberia. And so that's what the UN Convention did in 1951. But of course, times have moved on. And I'm sure Churchill, no one should actually assume to know what someone in the past would think. But I believe we should have a new convention that says refugees and peoples must be rehoused within their continent of origin. And I'm utterly sure and convinced, Churchill would have understood the importance of the British race around the world. He wrote his book he always spoke about the British race being a British peoples. And when he spoke about race, it was Americans, Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. And he did everything in his life to fight for their survival. And so I think he would be aghast to hear the slurs laid against him in recent months and years.
If he was transported through time, he'd be calling Nigel Farage left wing. Rafe, pleasure as always.